Section 13 of The Age of the Condottieri by Oscar Browning. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 6. The Turks in Europe, Part 2. The finest character in this dismal narrative of cowardice and incompetence is Skanderbeg, the ruler of Albania, who maintained the independence of his native land during his lifetime. His proper name was George Castriot, and when Albania had been compelled in the reign of Amurath II to submit to the authority of the Sultan, he went with his 3 brothers to Adrianople. Amurath treated him with great distinction and gave him a high command. He concealed his plans till they were well matured, and behaved as a devoted servant of the Porte. But when, in 1444, the Turks were retreating before the columns of the Hungarians, he threw off the mask and was received with acclamation by the people. He was assisted by the Venetians, and in the Battle of Debra in the same year he gained a splendid victory in which 22,000 Turks were killed. On the 3 days, October 17th through 20th, 1448, was fought the Battle of Kosovo, or the Blackbird Field as it is called, certainly one of the decisive battles of the world. After 3 days' hard fighting, the Hungarians were entirely defeated, and even the valour of John Hunyadi could not save them. And Servia and Bulgaria were conquered at the same time. Yet Skanderbeg remained unsubdued. Behind the walls of Croya he laughed at the power of Amurath. All Europe looked on with wonder at his hardihood, and sent him presents and embassies of honour. Amurath II died in 1451. His son, Mohammed II, found Skanderbeg as invincible as his father had found him. In 2 succeeding years, 1455 and 1456, he completely defeated the Turkish forces, and in 1 year took 3 generals prisoners. Mohammed tried to get rid of Skanderbeg by treachery, but fraud was not more successful than force. He then made peace with him, but this was not of long duration. Year after year the old quarrel broke out again, and always to the advantage of the Albanians. When he died, in January 1467, at the age of 63, his country was independent, while the Venetians were losing one possession after another. Skanderbeg left his territory under the protection of the Venetians, but Mohammed made it a point of honour to obtain the place for which he had so long struggled, and he desired to have Albania as a starting point for the invasion of Italy. The Albanian Scutari was defended by Antonio Loredano with the greatest courage in 1447, and the Turks were forced to retire. But the respite was a short one. 4 years later Scutari and Croya were captured by Mohammed II, and their possession was secured to him by the Peace of Constantinople in 1479. One of the transient intervals of peace with Skanderbeg gave Mohammed the opportunity of completing the conquest of Bosnia. The country was torn asunder by intestine strife, not only political but religious. The king, Stephen Thomas, 1443 to 1459, had wavered between submission to the Turk and dependence on the strength of Hungary. After his death, the throne was contested by 3 competitors. Bosnia, like Bulgaria, was the seat of that rare form of belief called the Paulician heresy, which, spreading westwards from the fastnesses of the Balkans, had supplied Italy, Germany, and southern France with devoted martyrs. The Pope could not avoid taking part against the heretics, possessed though he was with a fiery zeal against the Turks. The country was completely conquered in the 2 years 1462 to 1463. The Paulician landowners allowed themselves to be easily converted to the Mohammedan faith, and it is said that the numerous Mohammedan proprietors who offered the keenest assistance to the occupation of Bosnia by the Austrians in 1879 were the descendants of Christian ancestors. 2 years later the Herzegovina was incorporated with the Turkish Empire. The Montenegrins withdrew into their mountain fortress and maintained a war of independence against the Moslems for 400 years, until they were recognized by the Treaty of Berlin. Wallachia was governed by a despot, Vlad IV., whose cruelties were worse than those of any Italian tyrant. He is said to have put to death in a few years 20,000 people of every condition, age, and sex. He paid tribute to the Porte, but seeing that Mahomet had determined to conquer him, he made an alliance with Matthias Corvinus. After atrocities far worse than any which in the present century have been witnessed in the East, Vlad was defeated and went to live in Hungary, where he was kept in prison. After his death, Wallachia became entirely Turkish. The brother of the emperor, Constantine Palaiologus, governed the Wallachians with the title of despot or lord. The tyranny of the Sultan drove them to revolt, and the Peloponnesus was finally conquered in 1461. The proud race of the Palaiologi sank into obscurity. The Duchy of Athens, once held by Walter of Brienne, was now in the hands of the Florentine family of the Acciajuoli. They had been at first tributary to the Venetians, but since 1295 had owed allegiance to the Turks. Family quarrels and disputed succession gave Mahomet an opportunity of conquering the country in 1455. Thebes and Boeotia suffered the same fate. The Parthenon, which had been converted into a Christian church, was now turned into a mosque. A Turkish garrison took possession of the Acropolis. Thus, in 10 years from the time of his accession, Mahomet had achieved the conquest of the whole of Greece. It would be foreign to the plan of this work to trace the development of the Turkish Empire toward the east. Suffice it to say that the Byzantine Empire of Trebizond fell in 1462, Caramania, the eastern part of Asia Minor, was finally subdued in 1473, and that the Crimea, including the Genoese emporium of Kaffa, was conquered in 1475. But the struggle of the Turks with the great European power of Venice must be described in some detail. The islands of the Greek archipelago were all this time in the possession of various Frankish princes of Italian origin, chiefly Venetians or Genoese. Mahomet saw that in order to extend his conquests over this region, it was necessary to prepare a fleet. The fate of these small principalities was not uncertain. Their absorption by the Turks was only a question of time. They attempted to put off the fatal day by paying tribute and by submission, and whilst Mahomet was fully employed elsewhere, he was content to leave matters in a state of indecision. In 1462, as soon as he felt himself free, he prepared for a powerful attack on Lesbos, then held by a Gattaluzi of Genoa, whose ancestor had married a princess of the Palaiologi. An opportunity was as usual afforded by family dissensions. Lesbos was besieged and taken by storm on September 19th, 1462, and the inhabitants were killed or taken prisoners. The Venetians were much blamed for allowing this island to fall without attempting to defend it, but they feared to bring upon themselves the scourge of the Sultan's power. Pius II saw country after country and island after island fall under the grasp of the Moslems, without being able to rouse Christendom to the rescue. At last, in 1463, stimulated by the loss of Argos, the Venetians were persuaded to declare war. Argos and Corinth were soon taken and lost again. The last sight which gladdened the eyes of the dying Pope was the sailing of a Venetian fleet into the harbour of Ancona. It is true Paul II was a Venetian, but Turkish diplomacy was then as now skilful in sowing dissension between rival powers and in preventing union for a common object. King Ferrante received a Turkish embassy at Naples, and the court of Milan accepted presents from the Sultan. An alliance with Skanderbeg gave the Venetians hope for a time, but their plans were shattered by the defeat of both fleet and army at Patras in the spring of 1467. Barbarigo, their general, was taken prisoner, and Vittorio Capello, their great admiral, died of a broken heart. The death of Skanderbeg in the same year was another blow. The Venetians offered Mohammed II peace, but he refused to accept it, and the war continued. The conquest of the town of Inas by a new Venetian admiral named Niccolo Canale roused Mahomet to a desire for vengeance. He determined to direct all his strength against Negropont, the chief possession of the Republic in Greek waters. This island, called Euboea in ancient times, lies along the north-east coast of Attica, and is joined by a bridge to the mainland. The second and final storm took place on July 11th, 1470, and on the following morning the island was taken. The inhabitants were treated with the utmost cruelty. The fate of this island produced scarcely less effect in Europe than the taking of Constantinople. Canale, the admiral whose hesitation was thought to have lost the island, was sent into exile, and Pietro Mocenigo was appointed his successor. For several years the war continued in desultory fashion. Mocenigo succeeded in burning and plundering some towns on the coast of Asia Minor, and in assisting the inhabitants to avenge themselves upon the Turks. But this kind of warfare was almost as disastrous to the Venetians as to their enemies. Commerce was interrupted, and the very purpose for which emporia had been established in the East ceased to have any existence. In 1471 the Turks carried the war into the Italian territory. They crossed the river Isonzo, pressed on to the Tagliamento and the Piave, and wasted fields and villages with fire and sword. At last peace became a necessity for the existence of the Republic. For 15 years they had attempted to defend their hard-won possessions. Their commerce was now destroyed. The Moslem was ravaging their vines and mulberries. The coast towns of Albania and Dalmatia were threatened with destruction, their last possessions in the Levant were slipping from their hands, and Venice itself was wasted with a destructive plague. The nobles began to desert the sinking ship, and the government had no other course open to it but to send Giovanni Dario with full power to treat for peace. The Peace of Constantinople was signed on January 26th, 1479. The conditions were hard. The Republic was forced to surrender Scutari and Croia in Albania, the islands of Lesbos and Negropont, and the mountains of the coast of Morea, as well as to pay an indemnity of 150,000 ducats and a yearly sum of 10,000 ducats as a compensation for customs and tolls. The Venetians by these means rescued their remaining commerce, secured the towns which still remained to them, and were allowed to establish baileys or consuls in various parts of the Turkish states. A short account of the manner in which the island of Cyprus passed into the hands of the Venetians may fitly conclude this chapter. In the year 1191, the island of Cyprus had been given by Richard Coeur de Lion to Guy de Lusignan in exchange for the kingdom of Jerusalem. It continued in this family till the death of John II, which took place in 1458. John left 2 children, a legitimate daughter, Carlotta, and an illegitimate son, James. Carlotta married first John, Duke of Coimbra, and secondly Louis, Duke of Savoy. He was crowned in the Cathedral of Nicosia on October 7th, 1459, as the King of Cyprus, Jerusalem, and Armenia. James, with the help of some Egyptian Mamelukes, conquered the kingdom and drove Carlotta out of it. The Genoese, who had an establishment at Famagusta, took the part of Carlotta. The Venetians supported the side of James. Marco Cornaro, a Venetian settled in Cyprus, assisted James with money to conquer the island, and gave him his niece Caterina Cornaro in marriage with a large dowry. She had previously been declared the daughter of the Republic and crowned as queen. James by this means became the son-in-law of the Republic. The marriage took place in 1473, and a child was born in the same year, which was regarded as King of Cyprus under the name of James III. The infant, however, scarcely lived a year, and from 1474 to 1486 the island was regarded as Venetian. The islanders were worse off than ever. They had repulsed Carlotta for fear of falling under a Savoyard king, but they now found themselves under the dominion of a Venetian queen. A rebellion broke out in Cyprus, and Mocenigo was compelled to conquer the island. Catarina, after her husband's death, lived partly at Venice and partly at Asolo, where her palace still exists. The island remained in the possession of Venice, although the titular queen survived till 1510. End of Section 13.